Hello, and welcome to the online lecture for History 1102, The Modern World, for November 21st. And our topic today really is, well, it's the Second World War, but it's also how we get to the Second World War. Building off what we were talking about in class on Monday, and then culminating through the end of the war. Obviously, this is a topic that really merits more than a 35, 40-minute online lecture. We could spend a great deal of class time on the Second World War as a complex global phenomenon, but such is life. That's where we are. So here we go. Let's quickly recap what we talked about in class, what we've talked about the last couple of days, actually. Argue that the interwar period is marked by this sort of tenuous, that is to say, fragile recovery that, in general, the old autocracies had been replaced by liberal parliamentary democracies. But the stability of the post-war order was quite fragile, and it is undone by the Depression, which causes the democratic powers, the United States, France, Great Britain. France and Great Britain, of course, is still the real colonial powers of the world, to kind of retreat inwardly, to deal with their own problems, not be as capable of combating challengers. Even before the Depression strikes in 1929, liberal parliamentary democracy had been under challenge right away from dictatorial alternatives. The Soviet Union, of course, where the Bolshevik Revolution brought into power the Communist Party, which then set about basically creating a one-party dictatorship that by the late 20s is under the direction of Joseph Stalin. And as we argued in class, is characterized by forced industrialization, forcibly putting people on collective farms, mass starvation, and then terror directed at the population writ large. Fascist Italy is another challenger to the democratic assumptions about democracy. Fascist Italy under the dictatorship of Benito Mussolini, again with his hostility to organized parliaments, etc. The Depression makes these two, for some, seem stronger than they actually are. The Depression also directly enables the rise to power, as we argued, of the Nazis, the National Socialists in Germany. Now, the Nazis, of course, had emerged after World War I, like the fascists, as a violent, anti-liberal, anti-socialist movement comprised largely of young men who missed the violence of the First World War and the camaraderie of the trenches, or who were too young to have served in the war. Nazism, as it was certainly an aggressively nationalist, sort of espousing a vision of a greater Germany, a racist movement, specifically with its demonization of Jews as not belonging to the German nation, what we call anti-Semitism. It's anti-democratic in the sense that it's hostile to the whole idea of parliamentary democracy. And it's anti-socialist, even though there's a socialist in its name. It's anti-socialist, and that means it's hostile to the working class parties that had emerged in the early 20th century, sometimes that were explicitly, by the 1920s, linked to the Soviet Union, but moreover were explicitly committed to bringing about a revolution of the working, of the proletariat, of the working man. And while the Nazis and the fascists make noises about making things better for workers, what they really are doing is they are sort of attacking those working class movements in the name of bringing about the interests of the nation, sort of the national community. As we saw then after 1933 in Germany, the Nazis, once they come into power, and they're invited into power by the conservative political parties who see them as a useful ally, the Nazis institute a mixture of repression, violence directed at their political opponents, banning other political parties, shutting down trade unions, other forms of alternative civil society that could challenge their monopoly on people's hearts and minds. Violence against political opponents, it's a whole network of punitive concentration camps, not extermination camps. Well, people died there, but they're designed to sort of punish people. Increasingly virulent anti-Semitism, increasing restrictions that target Jews in Germany. As I argued in class, the anti-Semitism of the Nazis before World War II is odious, but it's not aimed at murdering Jews. It's aimed at making their life as unpleasant as possible, trying to encourage them to leave Germany. And we're not talking about a huge population, half of 1% within Germany itself. And as I suggested, the German population as a whole isn't really cool with, the sort of the more I don't know, overtly violent activities of some of the Nazi members towards Jews, smashing store windows, humiliating Jews in public, etc. But they are seemingly okay with the slow erosion of the Jewish presence from German life, legal restrictions that make it hard for Jews to own businesses, to have jobs, etc. Okay, that's all going on before 1939. At the same time, that is accompanied by community building. And that sounds creepy when we talk about Nazism, but really we're talking about the system of rewards for Germans of the right, quote unquote, right ethnic background, who were quote unquote pure German, Aryan Germans, whatever weirdo racial fantasies that the Nazis had, right? That these were the people within the Nazi community who were targeted for rewards. So, unemployment, they got to take part in the public works projects like building the Autobahn, the highway, or they were eligible for winter charity aid, or they belonged to the Strength Through Joy organization, which theoretically offered workers vacations to other parts of Europe where they could see how terrible everything was for everybody else. Here's a poster on the left from, clearly a modern German liner in some part of the Mediterranean, probably Spain or, I don't know, Italy or Greece, where clearly the young woman here is waving goodbye to this wonderful ship with the people on board. This poster on the right, I think, is even more interesting as a vision of community. Right? It's a poster for the KDF wagon, which was a program that theoretically was going to give German workers their own car for under 1,000 marks. They had the money taken out of their paychecks. They didn't have any choice about it. So this goes to show that community building has violence built into it too. But this was encouraged as a reward, right, for workers to support, be on board with the Nazi apparatus. And so the poster says, "Dein KDF-Wagen," your KDF-Wagen. And if this were in class, I would have made you make up stuff about this poster on the right, which is depicts this obviously this happy couple in their car. You think about what the mobility means. The background is clearly meant to show off sort of the beautiful Germany. They're driving on roads that are built under the Nazis. Again, imaginarily, because these cars are never actually delivered until after World War II, when this becomes the basis for the Volkswagen. This woman who's standing up there, she's an interesting figure, isn't she? Because she's got shortish hair, she's got her sleeves rolled up, but she's also wearing a skirt, it seems like. So she's tastefully attired. She's not too scandalous. She's not really the new woman, but she has short hair, so modern and yet, less scary at the same time. She's clearly enjoying life. Both the people in this car are, clearly coded as racially German. Also orange, because this has, not just because of the way this print has been done. This is the era when people think that having, for people of European descent, having sort of bronze, tan skin was a sign of healthiness and not a sign of skin cancer, which of course it actually is, when people are excessively exposed to the sun like that. So different medical understanding of what was good. But, think about what this image might mean, what it's suggesting for mobility. And again, this is produced by the association, the organization that tried to, basically, that German workers belonged to, that tried to promote leisure opportunities for them. All as a way of showcasing how great, quote unquote, Nazism was for them. Of course, again, they were forced to donate money for this. Also, it's worth pointing out that none of the cars were ever delivered, and by and large, the KDF didn't really reward as many workers as it claimed it was doing. Again, but this is the image it's portraying. All right. I want to talk also about Japan as an example of an anti-democratic challenger that emerges in the 1930s, an anti-democratic challenger to the old order. And I think that's actually another thing that's unifying the Soviet Union, fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, and Japan, is that all of them are dissatisfied with the post-World War I global order that's still dominated by Britain and France. They feel that they've been wronged to some degree by the post-war peace, and they're trying to rewrite it. Revisionism. So that's another way that they're connected. In Japan, Japan by the time of the Depression, the Depression hits, Japan had been moving. The government was increasingly in the hands of unelected bureaucrats in the military. There was a parliament, not a super democratic one, but most of the day-to-day running of the country is done by increasingly by the military. The Depression has a big impact here too on the course Japan takes, because the Depression causes Japan's trade, much of its trade with Asia and the U.S. to collapse. America puts import barriers, puts tariffs on Japanese goods after 1930. That craters Japanese exports. Raises unemployment in Japan, causes some problems with the yen, with the Japanese currency. And so the Japanese government is now sort of faced with this dilemma of how to proceed. And again, it's increasingly dominated by a group of military officers who argue that foreign expansion could create a self-sufficient, contained economic bloc that would make Japan secure. And this is what happens. In mid-1931, September 1931, the Japanese army stages an explosion on a Japanese-oriented train line, a Japanese-run train line in South Manchuria. You can see on the map here to the east of Japan, or to the west of Japan, the big red blob that's Manchukuo. That's what's going to become Japanese Manchuria after this. Manchukuo being the Japanese name for Manchuria. The explosion on the railway line is the pretext for thousands of Japanese troops to move forward into Manchuria, which becomes a puppet state called Manchukuo, a puppet state of Japan. The military also sort of expands its foothold in Shanghai, in China itself. So really from 1931 onward, the Japanese they've kind of occupied Manchuria and they're aggressively expanding their foothold in China. This is documented by the very well, the empirical source. If any of you are familiar with Tintin, or Tintin as he's often called in English. It's a Belgian comic, very popular in Europe, and subject of a recent movie, Spielberg adaptation. The Blue Lotus is set in China in the 1930s. It's written several years after this, actually. And, it's also racist in the way that 1930s stuff is always racist about people from Asia. But it's really interesting because here our intrepid reporter is, sort of following the Japanese character, and then he watches them blow up the track, and then they catch him. So, The Blue Lotus, highly recommended as a cultural document about this. So the Japanese occupy Manchuria and then shortly thereafter expand, sort of increasingly put pressure on China, expanding their foothold there. I should back up to say that by 1936, the Japanese announced their plans to integrate the economies of Japan, Manchukuo, parts of northern China, Taiwan, and Korea, of course, which is already a Japanese colony. And it's from this point on to integrate these into a sort of a seamless economic bloc. It's from this period, too, that Japanese rule in Korea becomes even more invasive, whether it's sort of forcing Koreans to adopt Japanese surnames, speak Japanese, or it's drafting lots and lots of men and women to go work in Japan, men working in the mines, women. Certainly by the time we get to the war, the full-fledged war, Korean women are being sort of forcibly dragged into prostitution, an ongoing huge point of contention between Japan and Korea to this day. Meanwhile, elsewhere in China itself, I should point out that one of the reasons why the Japanese are able to kind of do what they're doing is because China is going through this sort of period of fractured government. Much of China is theoretically under the control of the military strongman Chiang Kai-shek by the late 20s, early 30s, although his rule is never quite as established as he would like it to be, despite all the American money that comes in to support him. He faces sort of a long-term problem with the Chinese communists who by the late 30s are kind of out in exile, sort of away from the coasts, who are undermining his own authority. But China is sort of a military strongman of this era, in ways that look a little bit like the military government in Japan, except they're less effective. You could also point to someone like Kemal Ataturk in Turkey as another example of sort of a strongman dictator leader that around the world who emerges in this period. And all of these anti-democratic challengers, if I want to think broadly, fascism, Nazism, to a certain extent the Soviet Union, although that's kind of its own case, military Japan, to a certain extent Chiang's China. All of these movements are anti-parliamentary. They are sort of hostile to democratically elected parliaments. And the idea of sort of representative government, even though Japan doesn't have a one-man dictatorship like these other ones did, there's sort of the same embrace of sort of leaders rather than people who are not sort of directly elected by the public. All of these groups believed also that sort of made noises about promoting a national community in which certain people belonged and certain people didn't belong. Some of them, they all sort of shared, to a certain degree, the idea that the state needed to intervene more aggressively in the economy. And they all embraced violence and struggle and military expansion. I think that's part of it. Again, this applies partially to some and more to others than not. But I think the take home here is that in the 20s and 30s, across the world, you do see the rise of sort of forces that explicitly challenge, on the one hand, the post-World War I order. And we could add also, of course, the anti-colonial rumblings to that too, the agitation in India and places like that, which is different than what I'm talking about here. But all of these anti-democratic challengers specifically are trying to undo, some way, the post-World War settlement. And they, by and large, also are sort of rejecting the assumptions about rights and democracy that theoretically the winners of World War I were spreading around the globe. Okay. That takes us, well, that sort of sets the groundwork then for the run-up to the Second World War. This is, I will deal with this in this kind of, briefly, of course, and this online lecture doesn't do justice to it, as a global conflict. But a global conflict that is different than the way that the First World War was a global conflict. The First World War was global because it involved actors from around the globe. There was some fighting in various theaters, like in Africa and a little bit in the Pacific, and certainly in the Ottoman world in the Middle East. But most of the global nature of the First World War came from the way it drew people from the colonial periphery, people like Conde Camara in Guinea, in French Africa, to fight for the European powers. Whether they were fighting in Europe or fighting in the Middle East, like the Indian troops who were fighting there. Right. The basic dynamic is it pulls people from around the world into a conflict that's mostly located in Europe, a little bit in the Middle East as well. Whereas the Second World War obviously involves a much broader range of fighting, as we'll see. One of the major theaters for the war is the Pacific Theater against Japan, which of course has fighting ranging all the way from northern China to the frontier between Burma and India, and all the way basically down to Australia. Right? There's fighting in Africa, although sort of limited, fighting in the Middle East, naval warfare around the globe. Right? So it's a much more global conflict, and it's much more devastating than its predecessor too. Arguably the first salvo in the Second World War is the Japanese invasion and occupation of Manchuria in 1931-32. I should point out also that the Italians had invaded Ethiopia in 1935 in an effort to reestablish the greatness of Italian empire and to avenge the Ethiopian defeat of some Italian affiliated forces in the 1890s. The Italians, as I pointed out, do, quote, win this war partially by using poison gas and aerial bombardment. It's not a great moment in Italian history, arguably. But you're going to see this as another moment in which the post-war order is beginning to break down. The Spanish Civil War, which merits its own class, but too bad we don't have that time, basically pits people defending sort of the democracy in Spain. There's basically an insurrection against it led by conservative Catholic military officers. Francisco Franco is the leader of this. He gets support from both Italy and Germany, who are using this as a battleground to kind of test out their own. The Germans are using it to test out aerial warfare. The Italians are using it to kind of show that Italy matters. Doesn't work so well for them. The conservative nationalists, the Frankists, triumph, right? And so the Spanish Civil War is in some ways an opening act to the overt warfare that's going to happen from 1939 onward in Europe. At the same time, particularly the Germans are looking to reshape the map that was imposed on them after the First World War, expand their territory, reshape their map, and you can see this image here with its different colors gives you a sense of this basically the re-expansion of Germany after World War I. First in the West, where the Germans basically succeed in sort of taking back control over an area that had been theoretically demilitarized around the Rhine, but then increasingly sort of making noises towards, on behalf of Germans theoretically in Czechoslovakia and then in Austria, pressuring through a series of maneuvers that basically bring all of this area under Nazi control by early 1939. But I would say that the Nazis are always mostly interested in the East. not just the sort of the eastern part of this blob here, but the territories that are Poland and then into the Soviet Union. Because under Nazi ideology, these areas were historically German, but they were now being populated by Untermenschen, sort of inferior people, in this case Slavs, and in some cases Jews. Right? So the Nazi vision always was to expand Germany towards the east, which is going to explain to a large degree why Germany will invade the Soviet Union in 1941. And I'll come back to that point. Well, the war officially begins in 1939, in September 1939, when the Germans invade Poland. And here is an image of German tank warfare, the Panzer divisions. The German attack here is based on speed and mobility, mobile armor, mobile tanks, accompanied by aircraft that bombard the civilian population, disrupt communications, and it's all predicated on speed. This notion of blitzkrieg, lightning war. This is a war strategy, by the way, that is not necessarily some sort of tactical masterstroke, but it's meant to cover for the fact that the Germans don't have really the military that's capable of fighting a sustained war, certainly at the beginning. And so they want to sort of win as quickly as possible so that they can then cannibalize the resources from the countries that they take over. The invasion of Poland causes France and Germany to officially declare war. France and Great Britain to officially declare war on Germany. But they don't actually do. There's no shooting really until spring May 1940, when the Germans invade the Low Countries of Belgium and the Netherlands, and then into France, or Belgium and then into France. Should point out, by the way, that the invasion of Poland is only made possible because the Germans sign a secret treaty with the Russians, with the Soviet Union, claiming that they're not going to fight each other. And this allows the Germans and the Soviets to carve up Poland themselves. This seems weird, right? Because the part of the appeal of Nazism to its followers was that it was anti-communist, anti-Soviet. And the Soviets certainly had no love for the Germans, but this is a tactical pause. Hitler and Stalin recognize that they neither wants to go to war with each other at this point, and so there's this temporary peace that allows the Germans to kind of continue their war effort and to invade Poland and then to turn their attention to the West. Well, what follows is a series from this point onward up until 1942, really, late 41, early 42, is a series of German triumphs. That, within 6 weeks, the German army has overrun France, taking advantage of French disorganization and the lack of sort of mobile armor that the French army has. They've also swept into Norway and Denmark at this point too, because they're worried about the British accessing those places. The invasion of France, causes the French army to retreat. There's a small British force, an expeditionary force, that is evacuated out from Dunkirk, subject to the recent movie Atonement. Then, after sort of occupying France, the German army will turn its attention towards the east in early 1941. First to Greece and Yugoslavia, or to Yugoslavia and then Greece. In Greece, they're helping out the Italians who have invaded Greece earlier, but then have gotten bogged down. No disrespect for the Greeks, but this doesn't say a whole lot about the capacity of the Italian military. On the Greco-Italian front, there's actually not a tank shortage or a jeep shortage, there's a mule shortage that makes the war sort of not go anywhere. Anyway, the Germans come to the aid of the Italians in spring 1941, so that they have occupied. Actually, I'll come back. That happens after actually what I should have talked about, which is that in September, the Germans embark on this campaign to try to knock the British out of the war at the aerial bombardment of Great Britain, the Battle of Britain. This was supposed to be the prelude to an armored invasion, or to an actual army invasion. But that never happens because, first of all, because Hitler's attention turns elsewhere. The British are able to resist. They're defending their own territory. They have radar. They're taking advantage of radar, which the Germans don't really have. And they're also aided by the fact that the Germans are less focused on knocking out British industrial targets and more focused on hitting sort of places where they think that the bombing raids will demoralize the population, like the east side of London or Coventry, the cathedral cities. And, the British endure this. They're able to sort of withstand the threat of the war off, sort of inflict enough losses on the Germans so that the German high command turns its attention elsewhere, right? This is a key turning point in the war. Like if If the Germans had been able to somehow sideline the British, or at least knock them out, or make them sue for peace, obviously the war would have taken a different course. But it doesn't. The British continue. They're supported by American military aid, although not formal American troops at this point. Right. The next big shift in the war, as I've suggested, the Germans are already sort of expanding in Yugoslavia and Greece in early 1941. June 22nd, 1941, when the Germans invade the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa. This, initially the Germans, overrun the Russians all over the place. That the Soviets are forced to retreat massively, but the Soviet Union is also a very large place, right? And it's a dictatorship that can relocate a lot of its industries beyond where the Germans can reach it. So by the winter of 1941, the German advance has somewhat stalled. The northern column has encircled Leningrad, which will be under siege for the next 3 years. The middle column is sort of stalled outside Moscow, and the third sort of set of divisions is moving to the southeast, to the oil and gas fields of the Crimea, towards the Crimea, but also towards the Caucasus. This is the wheat belt of Russia, the Soviet Union. But the point here is that in 1941, both the British and the Soviets hold out. They don't capitulate. They prolong the war, and in prolonging the war, really, they set the seeds for the eventual destruction of Nazism. By 1942, the Germans are in charge of a great swath of territory, what I call Europe on Nazi time. It's really everything in the blue here. You can see Switzerland is in white. I can answer questions about why it remains neutral if you really care. Basically because it suits German interests for it to be neutral. In the West, life under German occupation or under a, sort of a local government that is trying to help the Germans. The Germans are mostly interested in just exploiting the economies, sort of getting resources, forcing, say, the French to pay them a lot of money every day. And this, of course, helps finance their war effort and, prolongs their war effort. But they're not really interested in overturning society to the same extent that they are in the East. The East, again, as I suggested, was always envisioned as this kind of blank slate, as this space for German expansion in quest of, the ugly German word is Lebensraum, living space. And it's increasingly here where, the Nazi fantasies about sort of creating German settlement, expanding German settlement to the East take root. Much of these are going to involve dealing with this is going to be at the genesis of what's going to come to be known as the Holocaust. But even before we get to that, the Nazis envisioned the East as a space to be populated by German settlers, right? So they actually, after they've overrun Poland, they're beginning to recruit ethnic Germans from all over Southeastern Europe, from Hungary, from Yugoslavia, to come settle in Poland. Again, it's sort of as the advance guard for a future expansion elsewhere. By bringing in settlers, the Germans are creating problems for themselves because, where do you put them, right? And so it intensifies the pressures and the racism already present. And the solution that becomes devised, right, is initially first to sort of take the non-German, particularly the Jewish people living in initially Poland, and relocate them into sort of concentrated parts of cities, into ghettos, where conditions are getting worse and worse. The hope is basically that they will just continue to, sort of not be basically that they will sort of die off or sort of suffer on their own. Really, it's the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, that changes the nature of what the Germans end up doing. Because, of course, there had been anti-Semitism as an integral part of the Nazi apparatus before 1941. And, but as I suggested, much of the efforts of the Nazis regarding Jews in Germany before 1939 was to get them to leave, was to make Germany a Jewish-free space, Judenfrei. Well, first the conquest of Poland, and then the invasion of the Soviet Union brings millions and millions of more Jews under Nazi control. Couple that with the fact that the Soviet Union isn't knocked out of the war, so that the Germans can't sort of, follow through on their fantasies of maybe relocating the Jews to Siberia or somewhere else, or there's even a plan to sort of send them to Madagascar, which of course doesn't go anywhere, right? It's the invasion of the Soviet Union radicalizes the war in two ways. First of all, it's an incredibly brutal conflict. The violence against civilians is even more dramatic than it was anywhere else. And it creates, again, sort of this expanded problem for the Germans because they've now sort of, they now control a significant portion of the Jews of Europe. So this is the context then for the evolution of the policy of the mass murder of European Jews that evolves over time. What I'm suggesting to you here is, of course, there was an ideological sort of, loathing or sort of victimization, stigmatizing Jews to begin with. But the actual sort of mechanics of the sort of whole network of extermination camps and sort of killing on the ground that comes out, that comes to be the Holocaust, that's really a product of sort of the situation as of mid-June 1941 onward, when the war is not successful in the sense that the Germans haven't won it yet, and it radicalizes. The war itself is a radicalized conflict, racialized conflict, and it opens up the possibility for mass murder in a way that wasn't really a possibility before. And so, and this is, of course, doing really an injustice to the Holocaust to discuss it here in 5 minutes. By late 1941, the policies have been set in motion, and they're never really sort of you can point to moments where you think that the policy is kind of crystallized, but it's evolving over time towards the mass murder of Jews, not just, and then the sort of the novelty, I guess, is not just in the theater of war here in the East, but then rounding them up from places of other parts of Europe, like in the West, and sending them to a network of extermination camps built for the for the purpose of murdering Jews, first even by overworking them, but mostly by sort of gassing them with some kind of either carbon monoxide or Zyklon B, sort of a chlorine-based gas. Right. So when we think of the Holocaust, we think mostly of sort of the extermination camp network that's created in Poland, places like Auschwitz for European other Jews from Europe, Belzec, Majdanek, Sobibor, Treblinka, Chemno. These are all places, sort of the big six actually, that are created for the purpose of murdering Jews. Roughly 3 million Jews are killed in the extermination camp network. The other close to 3 million or 3 million-ish are either starved to death or shot by roving military squads, shot at point-blank range in the woods, right? So the Holocaust is a much more variegated and complex phenomenon than I think we might assume it is based on Schindler's List or something like that. So again, if we want to think about this broadly, the Holocaust here emerges both from sort of the German anti-Semitic platform of the Nazi Party, but that doesn't really, it's the conditions of the war, particularly in the East, after mid-1941, when a war that is brutal and violent, violence against civilians is sort of increasingly present, and it's also sort of a place where the German attempts to make Germany a Jewish-free space now have encountered a huge German population. And so then the radicalization that happens there leads to the formal mechanisms to result in the mass murder of roughly 6 million Jews, but of course also a significant number of Sinti and Roma, inaccurately called gypsies. There are, of course, other people who are caught up in the punitive camp networks during the war, political communists, gays and homosexuals. But of course, the focus of the Holocaust is the murder of Jews. Well, even as that's going on, right, the tide of war is actually beginning to shift, and it shifts for a couple of reasons. And here I'm dealing, of course, with Europe, and I'm going to deal with Asia. The tide of war shifts in the East at the end of 1942 and the beginning of 1943, with the Soviet success at the city of Stalingrad basically the southeast, where the Soviets prevent the Germans from pushing further towards the oil fields of Azerbaijan and Iran and other places like that. It's an immensely brutal conflict, and it leads to basically either the death or the capture or prisoner of like a 500,000 person German military division. It's a significant setback. So you can see Stalingrad is really sort of at the top of the green here, where the Eastern Front is. From Stalingrad onward, as we go forward, it's from this point that the Red Army, that is to say the Soviet Army, goes on the offensive and begins to push back It takes a while, right, and it doesn't concentrate its efforts in different places. But certainly, as we sweep through the end of 1943 and into 1944, the Germans are in retreat everywhere in Eastern Europe. The Red Army is pushing forward, committing, and I will say, it's important to point out, committing horrific acts of sexual violence against the civilian populations that it encounters along the way too. The Red Army will pause briefly outside Warsaw in Poland where there's an attempted uprising against the Germans. Basically, the Red Army lets the Germans wipe that out and then continues on. So by the end of December 1944, right, the walls are closing in on Germany from the east. Meanwhile, the campaign has also shifted in the west too. And really, probably the first turning point is the invasion in November 1942 of French-held North Africa. France, during the first couple years of the war, has a sort of a collaborationist government called Vichy France. Part of France is also directly occupied by the military. In November 42, then, the British, Canadians, and the Americans, I should point out, of course, that the Americans have entered the war in December 1941 after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Hitler helpfully declares war on the United States because Germany, Italy, and Japan are loosely allied. And so the Americans are at war with Germany as of December 1941, too. Doesn't really mean anything until November 42 when American, Canadian, British, a few free French troops land in French North Africa and sort of push the Germans eastward towards Tunisia. There's also a British offensive coming from Egypt, so that there's, basically the German presence here is under pressure. Should point out also early in the war, the Italians who had been in Libya, the other part of North Africa here, are sort of overrun by the British. The invasion of North Africa sets the stage for the invasion of Italy in September 1943, when, again, sort of allied forces, British, Canadian, American, Free French, that is to say the group of French people who are following the exiled government of Charles de Gaulle, and not the collaborationist one that's in France itself. Polish army officers are here too. Land first in Sicily and then in the mainland. Begin to push up the Italian peninsula. Pretty quickly, the Italian government collapses. Mussolini is sort of forced out. He's arrested, and then he's rescued from prison by German hang glider division, paragliding commandos, who then spirit him away up to the north, where they put him in charge of kind of a puppet government called the Republic of Salo. Don't Google that because it leads you to a pornographic film written done in the 1970s. Anywho, okay, so the front in the west is shifting too with the invasion of North Africa and then the invasion of Italy. The invasion in Italy goes much more slowly than the Americans and British think it will. They get bogged down. The Germans have heavily defended the peninsula. The invasion of Italy does, however, give one tangible advantage. It allows Allied bombers access to targets in southern Germany. British and American planes had been bombing civilian targets in Germany, really from 1942, but particularly from 43 onward. Mostly in the north, the invasion of Italy lets them hit targets in the south. And this bombing campaign is intended to demoralize the German civilians and make them turn against Hitler. Obviously, that doesn't work. It just leaves a lot of rubble. The firebombing of Dresden is one example, right? This is the setting of Kurt Vonnegut's book Slaughterhouse 5. But you can sort of make the argument here that the bombing, at least on the one hand, does disrupt communication a little bit for the German military, which makes it harder for it to respond when, in June 1944, Allied forces land in France itself, Operation Overlord, D-Day, which we know from all sorts of cultural phenomena. The famous photos here of the men landing in the water, taking enemy fire, and coming towards the German beachheads, or the German defenses up on the ridge there. It's an incredibly bloody operation. It's a remarkably successful one, though. This amphibious landing of huge numbers of men, Americans, British, Canadians, Free French, some Poles, right? Again, trying to open up the theater in the West. This is in June. By the end of, there's also a parallel landing in southern France too later in the summer. By the end of 1944, the Allied forces have begun to basically pushed the Germans back almost all out of France, and certainly to some strongholds here. I won't deal with the color coding on this map because it's confusing, but the blue are the areas actually where the Germans are still in power in May 1945 at the end of the war. By December, it's sort of the dark pink, and the light pink is where they go after December 1945. Really then the months of 1945 are marked by the sort of the collapse of towards Germany from both sides. Although there's incredibly stubborn resistance, The Germans hold out in the Netherlands, almost starve the entire population to death, except for the aid coming from Sweden. Germans also have an offensive at the end of 1944, early 45, the Battle of the Bulge, that ultimately is unsuccessful. With the walls closing in, with the Red Army racing towards Berlin, which is in the eastern part of Germany, and the other allies coming towards the west, Hitler commits suicide at the end of April. After prolonged and bloody fighting, war in Europe comes to an end on May 8th, 1945. Of course, the war doesn't really end, right? The suffering of the people continues, and I'll deal with that in class on Monday. That's the narrative in the West, right? The war in the West, I would argue for you, is won because of the survival of Great Britain and the Soviet Union in 1941. And then from then on, the massive, massive industrial mobilization of the United States and the Soviet Union, right? Soviet Union, of course, which bears the huge brunt of the casualties of the war comparatively, right? But also that, is an industrial power in its own right. It's the Soviet and American sort of military industrial capacity that outlasts the Germans, that it basically dooms them to failure, to defeat. In the East, and again, I'm not doing justice really to either theater of the war, but hopefully you haven't turned this video off yet, because there's more good stuff to come. I mean, horrible stuff, but good stuff. Anyway, the Japanese had already been present in China. The full-scale conflict, sort of the outbreak of open war with the Chinese army, the forces loyal to Chiang Kai-shek, begins in 1937. Chiang Kai-shek attacks Shanghai, where the Japanese have a military foothold. It's turned back, and then the Japanese army sort of motors to the west towards Nanjing, takes Nanjing, and this is the so-called rape of Nanjing, when anywhere from 150,000 to 300,000 civilians are killed, but also there's an extremely huge amount of sexual violence directed at the civilian population. By early 1938, all the major Chinese ports, post-port cities, most of the railways, and much of northern and eastern China is directly under Japanese control, military control. The nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek have retreated to the southwest, to Chongqing, where they are getting funding from the United States through the Lend-Lease program. It's the same program that's going to give the British military aid, until the Americans actually come into the war in December 41. The nationalists are theoretically united with the communists, the followers of Mao Zedong, who are also hostile to the Japanese. But as we'll see, the nationalists spend most of their energy, seemingly during the war, or just as much time attacking the communists as they do trying to fight the Japanese. So they're kind of ineffective. The communists are much more effective at fighting the actual Japanese forces. And the communists, again, who are sort of preaching a version of Marx's communist revolution, but one focused on sort of the peasants, land reform, the peasants taking over from the landlords. The communists increasingly are enjoying broader support. When war in Europe starts in 1939, the Americans, who already were leery of what the Japanese were doing, start limiting the supplies of iron ore and oil that they were funneling to Japan. And Japan doesn't have a lot of these resources itself, and so this is really difficult for the Japanese military. Its options were, it could try to make America keep giving it oil and iron by withdrawing from China, which is a non-starter. It could invade like Siberia, where there are certainly are gas or there are oil reserves. Instead, the Japanese High Command makes another choice. In July 1941, to expand towards what is now Indonesia, to Java and Sumatra, and the oil and rubber there. So the decision is made in July 41 to attack the European colonial powers who are still here, right? The Dutch control the Dutch, what is now Indonesia. The Americans are in the Philippines, but they're kind of in the way. The French are in Indochina, that's say Vietnam, Laos, and the British are in Burma and then India. And so the decision is to attack here in support of creating what they call the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, an integrated economic bloc that sounds great on paper, but is really oriented towards supporting the Japanese war effort. After the Japanese invade into China in late 41, and they will, by the way, sort of successfully move to knock out, they will eventually be able to push the British out of Singapore. They will, overrun the Dutch East Indies, and they will push into Burma. But The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941 as a way to try to discourage the U.S. from joining the war effort. Of course, it actually motivates the U.S. to join. But anyway, in early 40, for the first part of 1942, in 1943, the Japanese are certainly expanding, they push the Dutch out of the Dutch East Indies. They go through Malaya, which is now Malaysia. They take Singapore. They overrun the Philippines, which the Americans are forced to retreat. Many Americans are captured, taken prisoner here. Thailand, British, French Indochina, and Burma. Really, so all this within, by the end of November 1941, the Japanese army is sort of pushing, in the first half of 1942, it's pushing its way throughout all of this. And initially, the Japanese are somewhat welcomed in some of these places as liberators from colonial rule, and then Japanese rule becomes kind of oppressive military dictatorship, and people like Suharto in Indonesia and Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam are going to sort of turn against the Japanese. So really by the end of 42, 43, so the early 43, the Japanese have established this enormous periphery across the Pacific. They pushed all the way to basically the northern fringe, into New Guinea there, where they're kept at bay by Australian forces. They pushed the British out of Burma, and it's largely geography that's keeping them from invading India. They are going to try to invade later on. Okay, that was my point about Pearl Harbor as a point effort to discourage the U.S. from fighting. Let's wrap this up. So, how do the Allies manage this war in the East? Initially, because we're talking really about the British. The French are not really a player in this. We're talking about the British, the Americans, the Australians to a lesser extent. The British and the Americans after 1941 are, sort of concentrating on the war in the West and in North Africa. The British are trying to hold the line here with Burma, and they do. There are a couple of famous battles at Kohima and Impal, where the Indian Army holds off the Japanese here on the frontier with India. But largely, it's a defensive strategy. The American military here builds up its presence, building up its naval presence, increasingly turning to aircraft carrier-mounted warfare as opposed to naval warfare from ships. The eventual strategy that the Americans adopt is a so-called island hopping campaign, where they try not to attack the most strongly defended Japanese islands in the Pacific if they can at all help it, but they instead sort of leapfrog from one to the other. This is, really begins with, the campaigns of like Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands to the east of Australia, and then, sort of moves up eventually towards the Philippines. The campaign here, really it's by late 44 or by 44 the Americans have landed back in the Philippines. It's in early 1945 that the Americans invade Okinawa. And of course, as they get closer and closer to Japan, they're able to have better access to Japanese targets bombing Japan. Most of the bombing, long-range bombing, had been initially flying out of China. But then, when they take Iwo Jima, the island there, sort of about 1,000 miles south of mainland Japan, this allows, again, sort of greater intensification of the aerial bombardment of Japan. The military strategy, again, is sort of the tide has turned. The American war machine is just so much sort of superior. Can do so much more than the Japanese one. The Japanese high command does hold out, and the Americans are very worried that an invasion of Japan would be incredibly costly, and in terms of lives and money, and so the decision is made to drop the newly developed atomic bomb first on Hiroshima, and then on Nagasaki in August 1945, which brings the Japanese to surrender. Meanwhile, in 1945, it's really only in 1945 that the British begin to remount their campaign in Burma here, and that sort of Japanese are sort of under pressure in the other parts of Southeast Asia. But really, Japanese forces are still on the ground in Indonesia, in Vietnam, and in China at the end of the war in August 1945, which is ironic. Also ironic that sort of Japanese forces are actually used by the victorious Allies, by the British, by the Americans, to kind of keep the peace in places like China, Korea, until Allied military personnel get there, which you can imagine goes over really well with the local population. Interesting fun fact, by the way, about Korea, which we'll deal with on Monday in terms of the Korean War. By the end of the war, the American military has quite a large number of people who speak Japanese, who are in the military intelligence, who are sort of dealing with Japanese codes, right? Who understand Japan. When the American military gets to Korea at the end of the war, sort of an occupying force, there is nobody who speaks Korean. Korea, of course, had been a Japanese colony, but the vast majority of the population is not super enthused about the Japanese presence and is excited that Japan is leaving. So who do the Americans deal with in Korea when they get there? They deal with the people who speak Japanese, right? The people who had been kind of benefited from the colonial occupation. So this is partially what explained. I mean, sort of in part the resentment. There's a lot of resentment towards the U.S. This doesn't explain the Korean War, but it's part of it. I should point out also at the very end of the war, the Soviet Union has sort of declared war on Japan and has pushed into Manchuria and is threatening the Japanese islands too. The argument is often made that the atomic bombs are dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to show the Soviets American power rather than to necessarily knock the Japanese out of the war. That's a story for another day. I guess we'll finish the story in Asia, I suppose, with the defeat of Japan opens the door for another civil war in China, but explicitly between the nationalists and the communists, who had been kind of fighting each other and the Japanese. That's to fast forward to this, and I'll come back to this on Monday. The Chinese communists win this by 1949. The nationalists flee to Taiwan, in part because the communists have much more popular support and are better organized. Okay. Almost done, I promise. It's a little longer than I thought, but hopefully you're still with me. How do we wrap this up? Well, I mean, on the one hand, it's an immense tragedy, violent tragedy. 60 to 80 million people die between 1937 and 1945. Much of that uncertainty is what's going on in China. And many of these are civilians. Only in a few places, the United States, Great Britain, Germany actually, and Japan, are the military deaths higher than civilian ones. But in every other place, like the deaths are just staggering. And give you a sense of this, the Soviets themselves lose over 20 million people total. 16 to 8, it's like 20, I think it's, I don't want to say 25, but it's a really big number, staggering number. 16 to 18 million of those are civilians. In China, 10 to 20 million people die. In Germany, 7 to 9 million die. The Japanese, 2.6 to 3. Roughly 3 million. Actually, I don't think that. I'm sorry, I take that back. I think that's combined. In Poland, 5 million civilians die. Much of the roughly 6 million of the Jews killed in the Holocaust are from Poland and what was the Soviet Union. Right. So these are huge, huge numbers, and it's not just the population loss; it's the percent of the population. In Yugoslavia, it's something like 13% of the population, the pre-war population, is killed. Right. So you imagine what this does is it not only kills people, particularly, well, not just men, but men and women. It destroys existing social hierarchies. Certainly in a place like China, where there's dislocation and war. In Eastern Europe too, where the war essentially destroys what had been the urban middle class in places like Hungary and Czechoslovakia, Poland, right, where either the many of these people were Jews, and so they're murdered in the Holocaust. Ethnic Germans in other parts of Europe flee at the end of the war, flee back to Germany, right? So they're no longer present. So it's not just death, it's also the way it disrupts existing social hierarchies, which, as I'll talk about on Monday, opens the door sort of for the foothold of communism in Eastern Europe. And helps kind of make communism in China even more seem legit. The war, on another level, signals the decline of European dominance, of a European-dominated world, at the expense of the two sort of big powers at the end of the war, the Soviets and the Americans, both of whom theoretically are opposed to empire. And the war, as we'll see on Monday, kind of calls the European domination of the world via empire into question. Okay, that was a lot of material, a lot longer than I anticipated. Hopefully you're still with me. Hopefully it made sense. Thank you all very much for your patience, and I will see you on Monday. So with that, I bid you adieu.